You still see the flags everywhere. The stark black background with the iconic silhouette of a Vietnam prisoner of war, and the words, "You are not forgotten." Welcome to the Beyond Survival podcast, preserving the voices, stories, and legacies of Vietnam POWs. Here's your host, Susan Page Coffey.
Welcome to the first episode of Beyond Survival podcast. My late husband, Jerry Coffey, was a Vietnam War POW held for over 7 years. And with Jerry's experience in mind, we at Beyond Survival feel duty-bound to educate all generations about the extraordinary courage of the American prisoners of war held in North Vietnam, shot down, captured, tortured, imprisoned for up to 8.5 years. They returned home with honor. In this episode, we are truly blessed to have as our guest Mike McGrath. Mike was a young Navy pilot when he was captured in 1967 after being shot down over North Vietnam. He spent years of suffering and yet had the human will to endure. A self-taught artist, when he was released by his own memory, he created a remarkable book of sketches showing the lives of the POWs and what it was really like in that formidable Wallow prison, which is nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton. It's just an amazing book, and we want to welcome Mike now. Mike, welcome to Beyond Survival.
Thank you, Susan. It's good to be here.
Well, first of all, we would like to thank you for your amazing sacrifice for our country. Only a few like you and the other men around you in Hanoi know what the magnitude of your sacrifice was. We, our listeners and production staff, are forever grateful for what you contributed to our nation. Mike, you were a Naval Academy grad, champion wrestler. I want you to talk about that. You were married to your darling Marlene. That's what I call her. She's a wonderful woman, truly the wind beneath your wings, I'm sure you would agree. Father of 2 boys, decorated combat pilot, later United Airlines pilot, and a naval aviator who spent almost 6 years in Wallow Prison. We all know as, of course, the Hanoi Hilton. So I'd like for you to first just describe your life, your early life, and how you got into the Navy and why you decided to go to the Naval Academy. Can you just start with that?
Yeah, it's pretty standard. I'm from a small mountain town in Colorado, born in 1939, long before your listeners. But it was like Happy Days, the Ron Howard series. It was a paradise over there, dating girls and drinking sodas at the soda fountain. But I did get an appointment to the Naval Academy out of high school, and and like you said, I was a wrestler in high school, and one time was a district champion. I never was a state champion, but I was a scrappy little guy, a skinny little guy, in 135 pounds, and I wrestled a year at the University of Colorado, 1 year out of high school. Then I got my appointment to the Naval Academy, and I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never seen an airplane coming from the mountains. So I had no desire to fly. I'd never seen a Navy ship. And I got this appointment to the Air Force Academy or the Naval Academy. But the Air Force Academy was going to school on Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. And they were in World War II barracks. And I looked at those barracks and I said, I don't want to go to college in barracks. At 18 years old, I had no idea what they were building, this beautiful Air Force Academy down in Colorado Springs. So at 18, I wisely chose the Naval Academy, not knowing where I was going to go. But the first test I got at the Naval Academy that summer, they had us all do all these different sports. So I said, well, I'll go out for wrestling. And I reached the championship level, and among all of the 1,200 students, or incoming class, and I met this kid, and he was tough. But I beat him in the finals, and I walked off the stage, and the Olympic wrestling coach came up and grabbed me by the arm and said, "Who are you? You just beat a state champion. You're going to go out for wrestling." and I was recruited right there. the wrestlers they recruited from the East Coast. Nobody had ever heard
Hmm.
of anybody from the West Coast, of course. But I did have a good wrestling career at the Naval Academy, and I placed a couple of times. I qualified 2 times for the nationals. Of
Hmm.
course, I got beat there, and I did place third and fourth at the
Well,
Eastern United States Championship.
let's
So
just say
that was good.
I wouldn't want to meet you on the street because you were tough. And I do believe, as we later talk about your shoot down and your time in Hanoi as a prisoner of war, do you think that wrestling career, I guess you would call it, helped you in many ways? We'll talk
Oh
about that
yeah, they're
later, but yeah.
tremendously well. In general, sports competition in sports prepares everybody for life. Everybody should compete, and everybody should lose once in a while, and enjoy the agony of defeat. And then everybody should win once in a while and enjoy the joy of victory. But
Hmm.
that's part of your character, as winning and losing in sports of all types. But wrestling was particularly very challenging. This one-on-one and had to do with conditioning and skill. And a lot of the wrestlers, a lot of the POWs in Hanoi were great wrestlers. You had Ray Voden was from Rutgers, and you had Atterbury, John Demizzi was from Rutgers, and Ken Fisher was a wrestler, and Dave Carey was another Naval Academy wrestler. The wrestlers did very well in combat. Both, they still do well, and mostly in the SEALs now. Most of the SEALs have had a wrestling background. And you've been beat up, and you've learned to come back. And anyway, so wrestling in general was a good sport for a survival of
Yes.
a POW.
So tell us about your flight, that fateful day when you were assigned. I'd like to know how you ended up on the carrier and your assignment then. And of course, you have something a little bit in common with the first man shot down, who's a dear friend of yours, I know to this day, Everett Alvarez. First man shot down in August of 1964. And turns out you ended up being on the same carrier, but at very different times. Explain
Yeah,
that.
it's I got my wings in November 22nd, 1963, and I was expected to get into an A4 like Ev Alvarez, but instead the Navy picked me to go back and be a flight instructor for a year. So I did my tour as an instructor. Then I got orders to VA 146 on board the USS Constellation. So before I could get to that VA 146, there was this young pilot, Lieutenant J.G. Alvarez, in a sister squadron, an A4 squadron, VA 144. And as we all know, he was shot down on the raid against the Haiphong PT boats compound. But so he was a POW at least a year before I got to the squadron. I got to the squadron in December 1965 and was immediately in combat. And off the deck of the Ranger, well, he was shot down off the Constellation.
Okay.
I had a cruise on the Ranger in between, and then when I got shot down, I had been in 2 deployments. I had 179 combat missions, and was on the VA 146 aboard the Constellation in the sister squadron of Ev Alvarez, and was unexpectedly shot down. Pilots have this great philosophy: something might happen to somebody else, but it's never going to happen to you. And I think every pilot in the world will know what I'm talking about when I say that. So my life was rudely interrupted, and I was shot down over Hanoi on June 30th, 1967. And then we go into what we're going to talk about today
Well,
because
yes, and I want to know a little bit more about. I'm interested in the briefings that you had readying you for your flights, and if you ever discussed the POWs such as Everett, some of the other POWs you maybe knew them. Did you know very many of the POWs at that point when you were just before you were
well,
taking that fateful flight?
well, in your home base back in NAS Lemoore, California, yeah, you did know pilots like J.J. Canal and my classmate Ed Davis and my classmate Paul Galanti. And yeah, you knew people. but they just disappeared. You know, everybody was shot down, and some were presumed dead, like Ed Davis. His family thought he was dead, and he popped up in a propaganda film a couple of years later. But we all suspected there was bad treatment, but we didn't know. Uh, so what we did, we all went through what we called survival training. It was a SERI, and the initials stand for survival, uh, escape, evasion, and resistance, and how to survive if you did get captured as a POW. And I will say that the SERI training, to me, was the most valuable educational course that I could have to survive in Hanoi. You know, when they had me on the floor and I looked up and I could see a little star in a guy's cap, and I said, "Wow, this is just like Warner Springs, California, where I went through survival training." But
I think Jerry went
I,
to another one. My husband Jerry, you know Jerry very well.
yeah,
You knew him, and but he went. I don't think he went to Warner Springs. I think he went somewhere up in the, somewhere. It didn't prepare him for life in the jungle if he had gotten shot down there. But he, what was one of the things in survival school, series school, that helped you the most? I know Jerry. I'll tell you what Jerry said was that when he was being pretty brutally tortured and he was put before a firing squad early on, right after he was captured, he said, well, the instructor at series school said they probably won't kill you because you're something of value to them. Did that
yeah.
help you? Do you remember that?
That is exactly my story. My instructor was a POW in Korea for 3 years, in the Pox Palace, a very famous and brutal prison in North Korea in 1953. And he told the story of that the same story that Jory had. He said they had him, they were hurting him, and they pointed a gun at his head, and they said, either talk or we will kill you. And he said, go ahead and shoot me. I will not talk. And because he had the same philosophy, he knew you were valuable and you were an asset and could possibly be traded at the end of the war, and they weren't going to kill you. If they were going to kill you, they were going to kill you. You had no, you whatever you did, you couldn't change that. Well, years later, I heard him talk at a lecture, and years later, I was in the same position. They had been working on me for several days, and they pointed a gun at my head and said, either talk or we will kill you. But my mind flashed back on my SERI training, and I said the same words. I said, no, go ahead and shoot me. And they said, no, you have not suffered enough. But that preparation from SERI school, like you described, was very applicable.
Mike, did it ever get bad enough when you sort of wished they would shoot you?
Yes, that's the short answer. Yes, I
Short.
wished for death,
Yes.
and I just jump right into this real quickly.
Please.
And when I was shot down, I was hurt very badly. I rejected it at 500 miles an hour, and my left knee was dislocated and spinning like a propeller at 500 miles an hour, which severed the anterior cruciate and the posterior cruciate and just left a bone spinning out there with hanging on by flesh and muscle. And so my back was broken with compression fractures, and my left arm was broken below the shoulder, and the humeral head was severed off and shoved in by my ribs and scapula, so it was out of joint. So I wasn't going to escape and evade. I was quickly captured and in very bad shape. Now, of course, they beat me up a little bit, and en route to Hanoi, and of course the villagers hit me with sticks, and the women. I remember the women would twist my broken leg. They'd twist it just to hear me scream, and then soldiers would push them away, and then they'd hit me with sticks and beat me as I went through the villages. But I ended up in Hanoi, and I was kind of hoping for medical treatment. I was in and out of delirium by then and pain, trying to hold a broken arm and trying to stabilize my left leg with the toes of my right toes. Were trying to hold this floppy leg from rotating around. And then immediately I went past name, rank, and serial number and into the next questions, and which I wouldn't answer. Well, they tortured me for 3 straight days. And in the torture, and I wouldn't break, but at the third day, they had my good arm tied behind my back in the rope torture and twisting. My
Sorry,
elbow
I'm,
went
I'm
out.
sorry to interrupt, but I want you, when you mentioned the rope torture, right at this moment, I'd like you to describe the rope
Okay.
torture, which
Well, I'll
you
get this in, but let
okay,
me finish about
okay,
the pain that Jerry went through. Because
all right.
I've read Jerry's book, and he and I went through the same thing. And the pain that you go through when they uh, dislocate your elbows and your shoulders is just indescribable. It's red flame. You can't think. You want to die, and that's the question you ask. I
Hmm.
wanted to die. I just was begging to die, and it hurt that bad. And then your second question is, well, what's the rope torture we describe? Well, of course, in pilot humor, we've called it the Hanoi rope trick. But basically, the the way they broke the really hard resistors like me and others that just refused to talk to them was they broke us with what we call the Hanoi rope trick. Okay, now you'll have to visualize. They sit down on the floor and you're sitting up, your legs are in front of you, and they've got you bent over forward with your head towards your knees. They pull your arms behind you, tie the wrists, and then cinch the ropes up so your elbows go together behind your back. Well, at about the time your elbows get close together, your ribs start to separate. And then they either rotate you physically with guys jumping on you and pulling, or they tie a rope to your wrist and then hoist you on a hook from the ceiling and let you dangle uh, with your arms behind your back until your shoulders dislocate. And when your shoulders, by this time, you're in such agonizing pain that you can't think. You want to scream, but you can't scream because they have a rag stuffed in your mouth. And that's when I almost died. They had me, my arms, both arms were dislocated, my elbow was dislocated, my back was broken, I couldn't sit up. I couldn't move my head for a month. I couldn't even sit up or move. And that's when I said, I want to die. But and they broke me. After 3 days, I broke past name, rank, and serial number. And always determined over the last 50 years and military debriefs, they broke every one of us. There was not one POW that survived sticking to name, rank, and serial number. And those who tried died. If you went far enough, you died. They tortured 28 of our guys to death in Hanoi. Pilots, aircrew like me. They hung on too long until they went over this. Oh, I wanted to describe that rag in the mouth.
Yes.
I was trying to scream, and they were trying to stuff a rag in my mouth. They couldn't get in, so they used a iron bar and they pushed and they chipped my teeth, but they got it down to my throat, and then I couldn't breathe because I have a deviated septum anyway, and my nose was full of snot, and I couldn't get air through my nose, and I was gasping and trying to get air through my nose, and I couldn't do it, and I was just I was just passing out, and they realized I was going under, and they jerked the rag out, and I could finally get some air, and then they kept going. So I know Jerry and others have described the same thing. My treatment was basically the same as everybody else. Jerry and I are just the example of the brutality that we all experienced.
Do you suppose, Mike, I mean, given all that, I mean, if our listeners aren't gasping right now, going, I can't believe this, I can't believe these men were treated this way, why did we not know? And that's the question that I'm trying to help answer, as well as just getting this information out so people understand the price of freedom and the cost of it. And anyway, do you think as early as Jerry was shot down, 1966 February, and he was the 60th man shot down, that these what Jerry calls these administrators, these little town, I would say probably the mayor or somebody in military that had been a militia officer, had been trained in this torture by their fellow officers or the military, because it seems so consistent that they know
Yeah.
exactly what to do, know exactly how to torture to get what they wanted.
We've always suspected, and the Syrian people had known, they got their training probably from the North Koreans. And they got their training from the Soviets in the 1930s and 40s when they killed so many people in Soviet Russia. But the treatment in North Korea was much the same as we did, but theirs was compounded by bitter cold and really more brutal conditions, even more than we suffered in Vietnam. And their training and they're trying to extract technical information about our weapons and our tactics was very similar to the POWs in Korea. So, in your answer to your question, yes.
Okay, then I guess certainly the length of time you spent was more problematic than the prisoners in North Korea had. I mean, the length of time. I mean, there's never been
But
anything like 8.5 years in any other prisoner of war
no.
situation, and even 6 years, which you went through, and even 4 years. So that's where I differentiate. But when you were shot down, and Jerry's described this also, there was a purge going on. Can you describe what that means inside the prison walls there in Wallow?
I went through the same purge, and let me explain what happened in July of 1967 in the Hanoi Hilton. By this time, they tortured me for 15 days before I just broke down and had to write something or die. And after that, they just left me on the floor to see if I lived or died. And it took me another month or two. I couldn't lift my head. Was just nobody to help me go to the bathroom. It was really brutal. But and I was going in and out of delirium, trying to hold my broken arm. I couldn't sleep. Every time I fell asleep, I'd drop my arm and then wake up screaming in pain. But during that time, the two POWs, Jim Lamar and Bill Frankie, taught me the tap code and to get into communication, because I know you're going to ask me
Yes.
about communication. Very
Right.
important. But at that time, I was the weak link. I couldn't get off the bed. I was hurt. But unbeknownst to us, while we were all communicating, the VC were just across from my door, and I couldn't see underneath the door to warn people, but they were listening to all of the communication in our building, and they were very upset of how organized we were. And out of that came what we called the purge. Now, the purge is they Stockdale and Reisner were across the hall from me, and it was a.
So
it was,
explain for our audience who Stockdale and Reisner were, Mike.
Ooh. They were the
Later.
leaders in encouraging people to continue to resist. And well, anyway, they
Go
broke
ahead.
up everybody. They moved us all around different prisons, and they tortured everybody. And that was a very brutal summer, the summer of 1967, which we called the Purge. And I think that's what Jerry's talking
Yes.
about, in which the treatment was just worse than ever. But let me talk about Stockdale and Reisner a little bit. Several years, about 3 or 4 years, Stockdale was a senior naval officer, and he was an air wing commander, and he just refused to break. But they tortured him, and everybody lost count of how many times he was broken. He was tortured and broken at least 20 times. But every time he'd come back and use the tap code, we'll talk about that later. But he could communicate, I'm sorry, I broke, I tried, but I want everybody to continue to resist, and don't give him anything unless they break you, but don't hold on to the point that you lose your life or lose an eye or a limb. Just give them the minimal information. But he was our inspiration. He came up with policies that we held dear for years. And one of his policies is that no matter what they do to you, conduct yourself with dignity and return with honor. So return with honor became our mantra, and it still is today. Here, 52 years after the war, we still use return with honor. But anyway, and Reisner came in. Reisner was an Air Force colonel that was a few days senior to Stockdale. And he took over the chain of command. They changed command, and then we had a new commanding officer named Robinson Reisner, a very famous Air Force pilot from Korea. days, and he was our leader for the rest of the time there. And then we had and other people. We had another famous guy named Bud Day, was
Oh,
just as
yeah.
courageous as Reisner, and Bud Day is revered by everybody as one of the toughest guys ever.
And won the Medal of Honor as well, was
Yeah,
awarded
he did.
the Medal of Honor. Yes, everybody does talk about it. He tried to escape too. It didn't come out
Yeah,
successfully, but
yeah. He escaped for a couple of weeks, and he traveled several miles all the way to the border with South Vietnam, and it was in sight of an outpost in the DMZ when he was seen and recaptured. But yeah, so he's got quite a story.
well, in Jerry's book, and of course Jerry told me this. He one of the things he felt after he finally broke was, and after he wrote a propaganda letter, was shame and guilt. He felt
Oh
guilt
yeah.
for such a long time. But can you describe? Did you feel the same way, that you felt
Oh
guilty or
yeah. That
shameful?
yeah that one. And that's one of this brings into a highlight of the advice from Stockdale. Exactly what you said. See, we'd gone through survival training and the code of conduct since we were all in the Naval Academy and West Point and Air Force Academy is to stick with name, rank, and serial number, and it basically said uh, I am bound to give my only name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. Well, that word bound, the way it was taught in the 1950s and 60s, was a powerful word. Bound means that you hang on and you don't give anything, information or tactics, until you die. That was the implication, that you hang on until you die. And so that's what we were taught. And so when individually, see, we can't talk to each other. We're all in solitary. We're being tortured. They're trying to get whatever information they can out of us. And people say, well, what else do they want? Well, they wanted propaganda. They wanted you to condemn the president, condemn the war, say bad things about our leaders, and it's basically propaganda as well as tactics. So back to this shame of breaking. So just imagine this. So, okay, we all broke and we all said something. We all talked. And maybe we even wrote down something, and maybe some of us even wrote down a statement that was bad against the United States. And then afterwards, you have this terrible feeling of I didn't call it shame. I called it guilt. You have this terrible feeling of guilt, like I failed. I failed my country. I failed the code of conduct. And maybe others didn't, and I feel guilty that I broke. So this guilt is consuming until it comes through the wall, and you learn that Stockdale has put out the word, "Don't feel guilt, don't feel shame. Everybody did the best they can," and so we all did the best we could. And I encourage everybody to have a bouncing ball attitude, that they may torture you, they may break you, and you may give information, but give the minimum you can, and don't lose your life, but bounce back like a bouncing ball. Bounce back to resist them again and again. Make them torture you to give any information, but don't go too far, and don't feel shame, because we're all broke and we're all on the same boat. But that advice from Stockdale lifted the spirits of everybody that felt the guilt that you described.
Oh, that's a awesome, Mike. Awesome description. I think you really nailed that in terms of the way that I've heard other POWs, especially Jerry, speak of that. And I think honor is such an important word, as you described it, and saying that your motto there was return with honor. Honor is so important, and it's inculcated into you when you're at the Naval Academy, and every step along the way in your Navy career or Air Force or whatever military you're in is honor. You want to honor your family, you want to honor yourself, of course, and you want to honor your country most of all. So you described that beautifully. Thank you so much. Now, let's get back to, we're going to go with the TAP code, because now I'm picturing you in your first cell. Do you have would you describe it? Did you have a cellmate? What was it like?
Well, no, I was alone after 15 days on the floor of of one cell. They got me to write a piece of paper, and I even misspelled my name, and they said they noticed it, and I said, oh, in America we can spell our name any way we want to. So you always meet up these little stories, and and some were humorous, and we'll describe that later. But
Yeah.
they moved me over into the Thunderbird, a section of what we call Las Vegas, because the buildings were named after buildings in Las Vegas. So I was in the Thunderbird, my first cell group, where most people were in solitary, and they were these individual cells. They were about 9 feet long, and they varied in width from 5 feet to 6 feet. But they were just cement slabs or bedboards. We never had a mattress in 6 years, or you just slept on the floor or on a cement slab. And they just threw me in there and left me. And and then here's what I hear. I hear this: tap, titty, tap, tap, and then tap, tap. Shave and a haircut,
Haircut.
2 bits. So that was our authentication code that you could tell an American was on the other side of the wall. So if you tapped on the wall and it came back 2 taps, you knew it was American. If it came back, several taps, you shut up and quit tapping. So we used that for an authentication to call up, and slowly they taught me the tap code of arrange the alphabet in 5 groups of the letter 5 groups of 5, leave out the letter K. So the first letter, the letter C would be tap, 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 tap. That would be first group, third letter, which is C. The letter F is tap, 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 which is second group, first letter. And then we learned people's names. In the end, I had 350 names memorized, but like my name was MM, so that'd be tap, 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 tap. I just described MM, which is my name. Oh, so you're so good at it that you start abbreviating, and T was the, and TT is that, and TD is today, and TM is tomorrow, and YD is yesterday, and GBU is God bless you. And so all these little shortened letters, we jokingly call it today, say, well, just like Al Gore invented the internet, we invented
Texting. You invented
texting.
texting. You must have.
Yeah, so all the kids that are using texting today learned it from us, from our experience in Hanoi.
So when you learned the tap code, you didn't see Jerry in his situation. There was a little matrix that somebody had carved into the wall, and he didn't understand it. You didn't have that, so somebody had to clear, so the guards couldn't hear this, and then somebody had to just explain it to you.
Yeah, they
That
did.
made it.
Like when I was tapping on the wall trying to learn, I'd use 13 taps for the letter M, and I'd use, and I use 5 taps for the letter E. So very slow until one day I heard this whisper, the guy talking out of an open cell and bouncing the words off of a moat wall that was around the prison. And he said, Mike McGrath, there is a code. Arrange the alphabet in 5 groups of 5, leave out K. And I heard this, and I thought this was in my delirium. I heard this, but laying there in solitary 24 hours a day, your brain has time to think. And I put it together, and luckily I put it together correctly, and that got me off and running. But it was very dangerous to try to teach a new guy, but very essential to teach every new POW the tap code.
Yes. Do you remember how many you taught?
Who knows? Yeah.
Many.
Yeah. Just anybody that came in. I will mention in communication, that's the glue that allowed us to survive, and because we could organize and this psychologically, this is very, very important. If you're captured in a Russian prison today and you're all by yourself, you want your family to know that you're alive. And same with us. We were isolated, but we wanted our families to know that we were alive because our families didn't know anything. So the first contact I had with a human being was next door to me. They got my name, and then it psychologically, it took great stress off me that somebody knew I was alive. Somebody could get home and say Mike McGrath was a prisoner, but he was alive. He was resisting. He did a good job. and get word to my family that they had contacted me. So it was very important. And communication, of course, did that. Got our names out, and we memorized every name we got. We all memorized, and it was tough. But you didn't have a book or a paper or pencil or anything for 6 years, or a letter or a Bible. And so everything that came through you memorized. And then we started learning language. My first roommate that was trying to help me, he spoke German. So for 2 years I learned German. And then there was an escape attempt. And then my next 4 years I had a roommate that spoke Spanish. So I memorized Spanish. I had 8,000 words in my Spanish vocabulary without ever having seen a book or a paper. And I became so fluent in Spanish that I took the State Department test later after returning, and passed it with high colors, and was assigned in South America as a naval attaché speaking Hanoi University Spanish.
People are not going to believe what you're saying here, because it's just mind-boggling that through this thick prison wall, you could literally use your knuckle and tap out a Spanish word, and you could receive that word, and you could somehow learn it and learn to speak it. It's Jerry learned so much French. He got 2 years credit at UC Berkeley when he came home, that he learned through the walls from another POW, Dave Carey, who spoke French. So these are unbelievable stories. Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing this. I'm assuming you were in solitary, but how long, at what periods of time, and was solitary one of the hardest things? What was the hardest thing?
Well, well, of course, the torture is the hardest thing.
Yes, of
But then
course.
following the torture is solitary. Now, I was lucky. I was only in solitary a few months, and the German-speaking guy, Conrad Trautmann, was put in to help me. But he'd been shot in the leg. He had a open bleeding wound in his shin, and another POW was sent in to help us. But that was Jay Hess, but he'd been shot in the head. A guard had pulled out a pistol and shot him in the back of the head, and the bullet, I call him a hard-headed Mormon, because he was a Mormon, and he was a Mormon bishop, and the bullet bounced off his head above his ear, and he was in with me with an open gash above his ear, and we could see his skull.
Oh my
And
gosh.
because we didn't get medical treatment. They didn't give him medical treatment. So, but that broke the monotony of being in solitary, to have these two people with me. So, but back to solitary, it's one of the most cruel punishments, I think, that you can inflict on anybody. And what happens is, well, in my case, I had to hold a broken arm, so that was suffering through extreme pain, because I had to hold it perfectly still. I couldn't lay it on my chest. I couldn't lay it on the bed. I couldn't lay it anywhere. I held this broken arm in and out of delirium and consciousness for the first couple of months. Of course, that was solitary. Well, you find out in solitary that your brain is whirling 24 hours a day. It never stops. It's always thinking. And then, the torture is that you run out of things to think about. So then you revert back and say, well, I wonder who was in my first grade class. I wonder who was in my my algebra class, and who was in my first team sports, and all of my teachers. And you start running through your life, and you say, well, I'm going to rebuild my life. And after about 20 minutes, you say, well, I've thought of everything in my life. What do I do now? And but you're just fighting to make your brain think of something. But in solitary, there's no help. Your brain, you're just seeking something to stop the misery, but it doesn't stop. So, yeah, solitary was one of my worst experiences, and that was only for 2 or 3 months. Other people were in solitary. They were in solitary for several years, but what kept them alive was communication. No matter who was in solitary, we would find a way to communicate with them, and that brought them into the reality that they had teammates and fellow pilots there that were on their side, and they could survive solitary by communication.
Besides military information or passing information from your senior leaders through the walls, Jerry describes humor being one of the best anecdotes for being down and solitary. And do you remember one of the jokes that went through the
Oh yeah,
walls to
yeah.
you?
Well,
Do you have a
well,
good one?
since I was a communicator, and also I could communicate, I could climb up on a door or a prison wall, and I could communicate to another camp using American Sign Language. So I remember one joke that came from the zoo over to our camp across the 11-foot wall, and I got down off the door and told the joke to the other guys, and I I remember this joke was somebody over there in the zoo just set a world record. They uh, they pulled a 12-inch white worm out of their nose. So, I mean, this is prison humor,
Yeah.
and uh, and some of the prison humor is pretty gross. So I can't describe it on this broadcast, but so there was some pretty funny things that were passed around.
That sounds more like reality than a made up joke. That, I think, qualifies as, yeah, prison humor. Let's just leave it at that. Right. But yeah, so also, what else did you pass through the walls? Jerry talked about
Oh God,
listening to people describe everything,
yeah.
engineering, building homes, teaching anything you could think of to teach through the walls.
Well, the language words, that was easy because we all know how to pronounce Spanish, and so Spanish and French were usually passed through the walls, but all those other things were usually passed roommate to roommate in the same room, because when you finally got a roommate and you got to know each other, you start sucking out the knowledge. If a guy took engineering uh, in in college, you would suck it out of him how to do it, or mathematics, or things. So you kind of learn from each other, and you drew from their ability. And in my case, I was a pretty good artist, and so I taught art in with a slick spot on the floor and a piece of stolen coal and a chunk of red roofing tile. I gave art lessons, and that was my strength. And other people had strength in designing homes, and one of our guys was a real architect, and he taught architecture and how to build houses. So you just whatever it is, you learn from your fellow roommate.
So, since you mentioned your art expertise, how did you teach yourself to sketch?
I remember before I was in kindergarten, so it must have been around 6 or 7. So I remember my dad drawing a picture with crayons, and I remember I was fascinated that he could make something flat look round by shading. And it was a picture of Bambi, and it always stuck with me. And then in grade school, I started sketching and doing that on my own of what I kind of remembered, and then it stuck with me in high school. I found out I could draw anything, I could sketch anything, and it looked pretty good. And so then I sketched through the Naval Academy, and basically I'm a self-taught artist. I just learned that if you have a pen in your hand and you learn how to shade and the key thing to being an artist is called patience, which most people don't have for art. You can shade and shape and
Yeah.
model and do anything, and I knew
Well,
I had that hidden talent. So what happened at the end of the war after 5.5 years, a week before we were released, they gave me a book, a little blank book, and a pencil, and I got to run around camp and I started sketching everything. I sketched our rooms and I sketched the toilet, and so at the end of my book, those last 4 or 5 pages were sketches I made in Hanoi and was able to bring out. And then I ran into this artist, Maxine McCaffrey, and she's a well-known military artist, and many of her paintings are hanging in the walls of the Pentagon today.
yeah.
But Maxine McCaffrey rode with me back to the United States on March 7th, 1973, and she saw my sketches, and she just started heaping praise on me and said, "You've got to keep going. You've got to keep sketching." And she just encouraged me. just this one gal, Maxine McCaffrey, who's since died of cancer, and but that inspired me to draw the drawings which you see in my book.
Yes.
My book is called Prisoner of War: 6 Years in Hanoi. It's after
Yeah.
52 years. It's still in print. It's still available on Amazon.com. But all of those drawings, I wanted to show my family when I got home what we went through, what my life was like, what it was like to be in the torture positions. So I sketched and sketched and sketched. And I had a stack of 56 of these drawings, and some publishers got a hold of it and says, "We want to publish these. These are important." And I said, "Okay." So they published it, and there it is. It's still in print 52 years later.
So, Mike, thank you so much for doing that. I want to tell you that these sketches are like the photographs that the communists would never take of the inside of that prison.
Right.
They only put out propaganda. And we are getting close to the end of our time together, and there's so much more I want to talk to you about. But to me, Mike, you and Jerry continue to speak constantly around the world about the prison experience and lessons learned during the experience. I think both of you deserve so much credit for bringing to light what no one would have ever known that went on inside that prison, because the communists certainly did not want that known. And there's a book, Hanoi Hilton, Images of Life in the Infamous Hanoi Hilton, and we didn't really get to talk about propaganda, but this is a propaganda book. I don't know who printed it, but if you looked at this book, you would think all you guys did was play volleyball and ping pong, and I think Jane Fonda must have read this book and seen it and decided that you guys had a great time in prison watching movies, and I think it was just a bunch of crap. And so I guess ending on that note, and we want to talk about your beautiful life after and how you survived. I don't know if we can do this in another podcast. Maybe we can have you come back, because you are so valuable, Mike, to the history. And of course, you are the historian for the NAMPOW organization, and you have the facts straight about everything about the POWs, their lives, I mean, how long they were there, when they died, everything. And the max facts is very important. I would say tune in for part 2, because we're going to have you come back, Mike. And right now we'll just say goodbye and thank you so much for sharing so beautifully.
Thank you.
I would like to ask our listeners to keep our wonderful fighting warriors who fly in the sky and rescue on land in your prayers and in your hearts. God bless you, and God bless America.
For more information about the Beyond Survival podcast, go to goingbeyondsurvival.org.